Hi guys, Goffy here and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I want to talk about some new Fujifilm recipes. I think an awful lot of us have used the kind of basics or the staples in the community now, like Fuji Weekly's Kodak Portrait, but there are some other recipes out there that look great, and I was trying them whilst I was out in Venice. So in today's video, I'm going to show you these 5 recipes, and importantly, as with all of these videos, I personally am not the person that made these recipes. I've got all of their socials, they're going to be on screen and down in the description, but if you really like one of these recipes, then make sure you reach out to the creator and let them know. Now, whenever I make one of these videos, there's always people in the comments asking if they can use a Gen 3 sensor with a Gen 4 recipe or any other combination in between. And the answer to that question is yes, of course you can. Is it going to look a little bit different? Yes, it will, because each sensor in each Fuji camera looks a little bit different, but at the end of the day, you're still applying the same settings in the same direction, so hopefully the image will still look somewhat like the author intended. Now, I'm not in the industry of wasting anybody's time, so let's get cracking with that first recipe. Now, this first recipe is by a fellow YouTuber, and I have no idea how I haven't come across this recipe before. The YouTuber is called The Big Negative, and he is a top bloke, and I've been talking to him over on Instagram a lot recently, and if you haven't checked out his channel, you really should. Lots of Fujifilm and Leica content. But his recipe has been made to mimic maybe like a vintage film look. It's become my favourite when it comes to replicating film. It doesn't really have a certain film stock in mind, but it definitely has that vintage feel to it. During this video that is linked down in the description where he's talking about the recipe, he says it looks best with a warm tone added. Now, the recipe itself is based on an auto white balance, but what I personally found was best was on a bright sunny day like we had in Venice, was actually changing the white balance to shade to add that little bit of warmth into the images, and that's where I found that this recipe really shined. And our second recipe for the day is called Vibrant Arizona, and it is by Richie over at Fuji Weekly. Now, I know lots of you have tried Fuji Weekly recipes, but that doesn't mean there aren't some hidden gems in there, and I think this Vibrant Arizona might be one of them. Wes Anderson is a really popular name at the minute. He's got a new film coming out called Asteroid City, and he has a very iconic look and kind of composition to his films. Richie over at Fuji Weekly with this recipe has been trying to replicate that look. Over on his website, he talks about some of the limitations with the Fuji JPEG settings to actually mimic this look perfectly. And if you want to find out a little bit more about that, then his website is in the description. And he also talks about how in post you can make these JPEGs look a little bit closer if you want to. This recipe really suited the feel of Venice. It has a bit of a warm tone to it, and that clarity of -3 adds a little bit of softness into the image. Now, typically, I personally, whenever I see a clarity setting that isn't 0, I change it to 0 because it bogs down your camera. However, I do think that -3 adds an element of softness that really does deserve to be in your JPEG, so I actually found myself resisting the urge to change it to 0, and I did leave it at -3. The -3 clarity also makes your portraits look that little bit softer, and sometimes in modern optics, portraits just look a little bit too sharp, and this really helps smooth them out a little bit. Our third recipe for the day is by a guy called Ivan Yolo. Now, if you've watched my videos before and my recipe ones, you'll know he's featured, and his website is an absolute goldmine when it comes to recipes. The specific recipe that we're going to be talking about today is called Ethereal Street. Now, this is a recipe that to some people might come across as being a little bit bland or a little bit subtle, but for me, I just really love the versatility that it offers. It's also built off the Eterna simulation. Now, I'm somebody that has been trying for months now to get an Eterna recipe that looks good. I've been trying to make my own, and I've been failing miserably. I think the secret kind of sauce in this recipe is that positive color value. It's taken the kind of basic dull Eterna look and adding maybe just a little bit of color that I think it needs to really bring out the best. This is a recipe that probably didn't suit Venice all that well. It kind of takes out some of the colors that Venice is well known for, and definitely suits a more street architectural scene than maybe it does travel photography like I was using it for. Because this recipe has a pretty subtle white balance offset, it means it's pretty versatile as well. The actual Kelvin value is set to daylight, and I found that I actually changed this to auto to make the recipe even more versatile than it already is. This means you can now use it pretty much wherever you want, and you don't get that funny kind of color cast that you sometimes get with other recipes when you're not shooting in broad daylight. And then our fourth recipe for the day is by a guy called Kevin Mullins, again, website down in the description. And this recipe has been made to mimic the look of Joel Meyerowitz, specifically his color work from the 80s. Now this is a recipe that offers a very stylistic, slightly grungy look to your photos. Now for me personally, it's a little bit stronger of a look than I am used to, but that really helped me have a little bit of fun with it because it was so far out of my comfort zone. I found myself having to really play with the recipe to get the best out of it. It's one of those recipes that maybe lacks a bit of versatility, but when you get it on that right photo, it really looks good. Now the recipe itself didn't come with an exposure compensation setting. Now I personally found that because the clarity is on +3 and the shadows are on +2, this leads to an all-round pretty dark image. And to counter that, I found myself really pushing the exposure compensation to the point I was running at about +1 stop. And I feel like you come to this funny dilemma when you hit that point because you're kind of actively making your JPEGs look better, but knowing you're overexposing your RAWs if you're still shooting them. So I end up with that kind of feeling of, I know I'm wrecking our RAWs a little bit by making the JPEGs work. A little bit of a trade-off, but I do think when this recipe works, it looks really good. Now for our fifth recipe, we're actually going to be looping back around to the legend himself, Richie over at Fuji Weekly. He's released a new recipe called Santa Color, and I think it's one of his best. Now Santa Color has been made to replicate the new film stock. There's a new film out there for all you film shooters called Santa Color. And when I say new, it's kind of new, kind of not. It's a classic repurposed Kodak film that was used for aerial photography, but it still offers a look that is a little bit different to what we're used to. Now I personally, if you've been a fan of the channel and you'll know this, really love a warm looking recipe, and this is one of them. And again, this is based off that Eterna film simulation, which I was saying earlier is one of my favorites, but it just needs that little bit of kick to it, and this recipe is doing exactly that. It's taking quite a bland look and making it look that little bit better. Aiming for overexposure compensation is definitely something that brings the best out of this recipe. I found myself running at +2/3 of a stop to get the best out of it. That kind of lighter look to your image really suits the recipe. Now there is one other recipe, so I'm going to give you a little bonus 6th recipe, and that recipe, and I might be a little bit biased, is better than all the rest because it's my recipe. And if you want to see it, you can see it here. If you want to see 5 other recipes that you've not seen before, see them here. And importantly, if you enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like and subscribe.